You walk through the cold halls of King John's castle, where broken alliances, love letters, and ransom notes blurred into one royal hobby: seduction by strategy. Tonight, as you nestle under your blankets and prepare to drift off, let us step quietly into the torchlit corridors of early 13th century England, where the stone walls of royal castles bore witness not just to military councils and parchment-bound laws, but to the scandalous private affairs of one of history's most unloved monarchs, King John of England, known to many as the treacherous king who lost the crown jewels in a swamp and earned himself the eternal ire of barons through his incompetence and cruelty. King John also cultivated a far more intimate and profitable pastime, monetizing the romantic entanglements of his subjects, and sometimes involving himself in those affairs for a price, a thrill, or both, while his father, Henry II, was building the Angevin Empire, and his brother, Richard the Lionheart, was off crusading in the Holy Land. John was developing a reputation not for courage or brilliance, but for a cynical, predatory understanding of the heart and how to tax it. Long before modern tabloids or reality television, medieval chroniclers were documenting the strange blend of lust, bureaucracy, and royal mischief that colored the king's personal reign. And tonight, dear listener, we wade through it all slowly, letting the boredom of feudal paperwork, marital law, and salacious confession lull your restless thoughts into a gentle descent toward slumber. John's strategy was as morally dubious as it was clever. When noblemen or wealthy knights were caught in affairs, or when women found themselves tangled in romantic scandals, John would often offer a royal pardon or silence for a fee. In fact, he kept clerks busy recording these financial transactions, known as fines for license to fornicate, in royal ledgers. Imagine a bureaucrat today processing a fee for extramarital conduct on government letterhead. These were real documents, signed and sealed, confirming that a man could pay the king to avoid punishment for adultery or seduction. The amounts varied, often depending on the status of the woman involved or the political leverage the king sought to gain. One knight might pay to cover up an affair with a noblewoman. Another might bribe the crown to keep a secret love child out of royal sight. But for John, it wasn't just about money, it was about control. Each transaction became a leash of influence, a quiet way to ensure that those who strayed romantically were bound to him in guilt and gratitude. It is said that even the church, which usually had strong opinions about such behavior, was reluctant to challenge him outright on these affairs, because he made the transactions appear legal, wrapped in the legitimacy of royal prerogative. His power was simultaneously petty and all-consuming, and for those beneath him, there was little recourse. His own love life was equally troubling. Despite being married to Isabella of Angoulême, young French noblewoman he wed in a politically scandalous union, he maintained a steady stream of mistresses. Chroniclers accused him of abducting the wives and daughters of noblemen and forcing them into relationships against their will. One infamous rumor, noted by chronicler Ralph of Coggeshall, suggested that he seduced, or worse no, fewer than a dozen women from noble households during his reign, leaving behind a trail of offended husbands and desperate alliances. Some mistresses were granted land or favor. Others simply vanished from the record. Royal scandal had a short shelf life when the crown controlled the scribes. And yet, perhaps most haunting of all, is the record of a woman named Matilda, a nobleman wife who allegedly fell into King John's web of seduction, and whose husband paid an enormous fine to have her returned, not punished, not divorced, just returned, as though she were a misdelivered parcel. The dehumanization of it, the coldness of the transaction, it tells us volumes about how royalty twisted love into leverage. In his financial records, King John even kept a tally of fines paid by men wishing to marry widows, especially if they had already eloped or taken them as lovers. These marriages were retroactively legalized for a fee. And so the king became, in essence, the medieval world's matchmaker for profit. It wasn't romantic. It was just another spreadsheet of exploitation. To truly appreciate the monotony and subtle terror of life under John's gaze, imagine being a knight in his court who has caught the king's eye. Not for your loyalty or your swordsmanship, but because your wife has. Imagine receiving a summons, not to battle, but to negotiation. You might arrive in court expecting punishment, only to discover the king offers you a choice: pay to maintain your dignity, or forfeit your pride and become royal entertainment. Now you understand why so many nobles hated him, and perhaps why they later rose against him. The Magna Carta, signed under duress in 1215, often described as the first constitutional document in English history, didn't just address taxation and military service, it also subtly rebelled against the king's personal abuses. Clause 39 famously declared that no free man shall be taken or imprisoned, except by the lawful judgment of his equals, or by the law of the land. But what many forget is that beneath this clause was years of resentment, not only over land, taxes and baronial rights, but over the ways John wielded power in private. Even the deepest clauses of constitutional freedom, it seems, had been fomented in scandal. Still, there's a strange irony to it all. In an age where so many kings ruled through bloodshed and battlefield glory, John found his battlefield in the bedroom and in the back rooms of his chancery. He didn't inspire loyalty. He inspired silence, shame, and payments in gold. There was no public adoration or triumphant statue, just a slow, crawling fear of being noticed by the king for the wrong reasons. Even his reputation in death was unflattering. When he died in 1216, likely of dysentery during a military retreat, not many mourned him. The legend of the lost crown jewels in the wash became a fitting metaphor for a reign defined not by grandeur but by pettiness and loss. He didn't go down in history as a hero, or even a tragic figure. He simply faded, like the ink on those ledgers documenting every affair he taxed and every heart he leveraged. Tonight, as your thoughts grow slower, and the flickering torchlight in John's castles fades into warm, flickering candlelight in your room, remember that history isn't always told through battles and coronations. Sometimes it's found in quiet ledgers, inked with scandal, sealed with wax, and hidden beneath centuries of dust. A tax here, a pardon there, and a monarch who measured love in silver. Sleep now, knowing you've glimpsed the kind of ruler whose legacy lies not in honor or reform, but in the paperwork of seduction and shame. The monarch who thought he was glass, they whispered it behind embroidered sleeves. In corridors damp with the breath of incense and fear, the king believes he is made of glass. The French court in the late 1300s was no stranger to rumors, half of them turned into poetry, the rest into policy. But this one struck differently. King Charles VI, once nicknamed Charles the Beloved, had become something else entirely. And to walk near him was to walk in the presence of breakable royalty. His fear wasn't metaphorical. It wasn't symbolic. It was real, visceral, all-consuming, and bizarre. The belief that his bones were fragile, transparent, and liable to shatter at the slightest touch consumed him like an invisible fire. Servants were instructed to move slowly, gently, as if attending to a divine relic. He wore reinforced garments, lined with iron rods to keep himself from snapping in half, and sometimes he'd sit still for hours, refusing to be moved or touched, terrified that a sudden jolt would reduce him to glimmering shards on the cold tile floor. He'd cry out at night that he could feel his limbs humming with tension, about to crack. Glass men, of course, do not go to war. They do not negotiate treaties. They do not carry the weight of a kingdom. But France didn't have a choice. This was their king. And so the court tried to carry on, even as their sovereign tiptoed through his palace with the carefulness of a man afraid of existing. Physicians were summoned, Parisian doctors, monks, even charlatans from Florence, who claimed to cure madness with scented herbs and goat blood. Nothing worked. Some blamed it on a fever that had struck him in the summer of 1392, a mysterious illness that had left him foaming at the mouth and shrieking in languages no one recognized. Others said it was sorcery, a punishment for a royal family whose ambitions had outpaced their humility. But the most superstitious courtiers said that glass madness was a curse passed down from ancient ancestors, something that cracked the mind when power became too large to bear. On especially lucid days, Charles could seem almost normal. He'd hold court in his golden hall, smile at foreign envoys, and sign royal edicts. But then, without warning, his eyes would glaze over, and he'd begin to pace in circles, muttering about invisible enemies or the sound of bells no one else could hear. Once, he forgot who his wife was. Another time, he chased his brother with a sword, believing him to be a traitor in disguise. The court grew used to it in the way people grow, used to plagues or bad winters by learning to adapt. Chamberlains learned to speak in whispers. Ministers learned to lie by omission. And the Queen Isabeau of Bavaria learned how to wield power in the silence left behind by a king too fragile to sit on his own throne. Politics didn't stop, just because the monarch thought he was glass. Deals were made in back rooms, armies raised without his knowledge, and treaties signed with seals forged to look like his. Charles VI reigned for 42 years, but he was only present for a handful of them. The rest belonged to the people around him, nobles, mistresses, and especially his wife, who quickly discovered that France might have one king by name, but several by influence. And yet, despite all this, the myth of the Glass King remained strangely tender. He wasn't a tyrant or a monster. He was, in many ways, a child trapped in a body that betrayed him, a soul too delicate for the Iron Age he lived. And his hallucinations were often poetic. He claimed to see angels, to hear flowers talking, to feel stars pulling on his skin like threads of silk. He said he could hear the dreams of his subjects at night, and feared their sadness would splinter him. What does it mean for a ruler to believe himself breakable? For a country to be governed by someone who fears his own reflection? In a time when kings were supposed to be divine, untouchable, and absolute. Charles VI became the first truly human monarch, human, perhaps, for his own good. When he died in 1422, France was exhausted from decades of regents, false treaties, and civil wars fueled by uncertainty. But some said the air felt lighter, as if something fragile had finally cracked and let the light in. His legacy lived on in parchment, in legend, and in the wary eyes of every ruler who came after him, wondering if they too might one day hear the echo of glass in their own bones. The Sultan who drowned in perfume, the golden haze of the Ottoman Empire's most decadent years, when tulips bloomed like silken fire across palace courtyards, and silk merchants from Samarkand to Venice bartered beneath domes etched with Quranic verse. There lived a ruler so obsessed with scent that his name became synonymous, not with conquest, but with aroma. Sultan Ibrahim, I remembered in hushed tones and mocking poems as Ibrahim the Mad had inherited more than the empire his ancestors carved out of Anatolia. He had inherited a palace soaked in intrigue, a throne stacked with blood, and a mind too delicate for the weight it was forced to bear. Born in 1615 and crowned Sultan in 1640, Ibrahim had spent much of his early life in the Kafsta cage, a secluded section of the palace where potential heirs were kept in isolation to prevent coups. This cruel strategy, while politically effective, often shattered the sanity of its occupants, and Ibrahim was no exception. By the time he emerged from years of solitude and silence, he was more shadow than man. Suspicious, withdrawn, and deeply paranoid, he was terrified of betrayal. Haunted by dreams in which his food was poisoned, or his pillows smothered him in the night. Yet alongside this psychological fragility bloomed a bizarre fixating one that defined his rule more than any war or treaty ever could. Ibrahim was consumed by smell. Not just any smell, but perfume-strong, exotic, rare fragrances that he believed held mystical powers. He filled rooms with ambergris and oud, burned sandalwood until the walls wept resin, and once demanded that rose oil be poured into the Bosphorus so the entire strait might carry its scent to the gates of heaven. Women in his harem were judged, not by wit or beauty, but by their fragrance. And he reportedly selected concubines by having them doused in different perfumes and paraded before him like walking incense. His obsession extended to his clothing robes, lined with herbs, turbans infused with clove oil, shoes stuffed with crushed petals. He insisted his courtiers speak of state matters only when lavender incense had been lit, believing that diplomacy without aroma was barbaric. Foreign dignitaries described meetings where the air was so thick with musk and myrrh that they left with burning eyes and headaches, unsure whether they had negotiated peace or simply survived a fever dream. There were stranger tales, still stories, of his sending messengers across continents for a single vial of Indian attar, or forcing ministers to bathe in citrus water before addressing him. And yet, amid this olfactory madness, the empire trembled. His extravagant spending on perfume bankrupted entire departments. One historian recorded that he spent more on rare oils in a single year than his predecessors had on the army in a decade. His paranoia grew worse, and he began issuing violent decrees based on whispers and dreams. He ordered mass executions of palace staff, convinced they were plotting his downfall. Once, he demanded the drowning of 280 concubines after suspecting a single one of infidelity, a horrifying act that sent shockwaves through the empire and earned him eternal infamy. While the empire still outwardly functioned, behind the embroidered screens, chaos reigned. The real power shifted to the court eunuchs, the Queen Mother Kaksum Sultan, and the Janissary generals who tried to balance Ibrahim's whims with the demands of governance. Eventually, even they could no longer protect him from himself. In 1648, just 8 years after taking the throne, Ibrahim was deposed in a coup orchestrated by senior statesmen and religious leaders. He was strangled in his prison cell shortly thereafter, brought down not by war, but by a mind undone by scent and solitude. His story, though tragic, lingers in Ottoman memory as a symbol of how absolute power, untempered by reason or restraint, can drift into surreal excess. His palace, once filled with the aroma of paradise, fell silent, and the halls he once perfumed, with madness, returned to the scentless business of empire. The historians who chronicled his reign did so with a mixture of pity and astonishment, noting that his cruelty was not born of malice, but delusion. He had not tried to become a tyrant, he had tried to create a world where fear could be masked by fragrance, where loneliness could be perfumed into beauty. But empires, no matter how scented, cannot run on rosewater and dreams. They require steel, structure, and the brutal clarity of reality, things that Ibrahim, wrapped in his invisible cloud of jasmine and frankincense, never truly touched. In the end, the man who drowned his court in perfume could not smell the smoke of his own ruin. And as the Bosphorus tide rolled back in over the years, the scent he poured into its waves was long gone, replaced by the salt of history's forgetting, and the quiet knowledge that not all madness is without elegance. Some of it wears silk and smells divine. The village that burned bread to ward off witches, in the moss-draped corners of medieval Europe, where village life was dictated as much by superstition as it was by seasons. There existed customs so peculiar that they'd make even the most open-minded time traveler scratch their head in disbelief. Among these peculiarities, few rivaled the curious habit of baking and then intentionally burning bread as a way to repel witches. Yes, in the centuries before Enlightenment, thinkers began poking holes in sorcery trials and accusing priests of hysteria. Many small hamlets believed that the dark forces of the world could be held at bay with the acrid stench of charred rye and scorched barley. In places like Bavaria, the Scottish Highlands, and stretches of rural France, this practice was not just common, it was almost ritualistic, repeated with a seriousness usually reserved for holy sacraments or royal decrees. Villagers would gather at the communal ovens, each carrying their loaves, shaped with symbolic patterns, crosses, circles, or spiral knots, meant to confuse and ward off malicious spirits. The loaves were prepared as normal, sometimes even laced with herbs like mugwort or juniper, known for their protective qualities. But just before they could be removed at the ideal moment of golden perfection, they were left in the flames, longer, allowed to blacken, crack, and smoke. The resulting loaves were hard as stones, bitter on the tongue, and nearly impossible to eat. But they weren't meant for consumption, they were spiritual barricades, talismans against witchcraft, meant to be placed on thresholds, hung above hearths, or buried near livestock pens. According to the folklore passed from one's face to another at fireside gatherings, the smell of burnt bread was intolerable to witches. It wasn't the scent alone that mattered, though it was undeniably pungent, but what it represented: the disruption of something wholesome, the intentional destruction of sustenance, a gesture of defiance against those who twisted nature. In a world where every stalk of grain was hard-won from rocky fields and uncertain weather, burning food was a sacrilege unless it served a greater purpose. Burning bread, then, was both an offering and a weapon, a way to tell the unseen world, "We will not be your victims." Some legends claimed that witches, upon smelling burnt bread, would fly into fits of rage, shrieking in pain and retreating to the forest. Others said the smoke itself was like a net that caught their evil thoughts before they could enter a child's dreams or curdle the morning milk. In coastal villages, old women whispered of sea witches who rode storms ashore, lured by the smell of rising dough, but repelled by its charred remains. There were even annual rituals midwinter burnings, solstice night sacrifices, where entire batches of bread were prepared just to be destroyed, their carbonized crusts crushed into ash and scattered into the wind. The church, while officially condemning many pagan practices, often looked the other way when it came to these traditions. After all, anything that kept villagers from accusing one another or the clergy of consorting with the devil was a welcome buffer. In time, some monasteries even adopted a version of the ritual, burning bread as part of blessings for sick animals or failed crops. They'd mumble half-remembered Latin prayers over the smoldering dough, mixing incense with the thick kitcheny smoke of burnt flour, and all across Europe, variations of the custom evolved. In parts of Romania, bread was not burned, but hidden in chimneys until it became rock-hard and smoky. In Ireland, scorched scones were left in stone circles under moonlight. In northern Italy, stale blackened loaves were soaked in wine and left at crossroads, places believed to be haunted by restless spirits and witches alike. Some historians today view this all as a fascinating example of sympathetic magic where symbolic actions were believed to influence reality. Others see it as an early form of psychological hygiene, a ritual that gave frightened people the illusion of control in a world full of plague, famine, and the terrifying unknown. But for those who lived through harsh winters and whispered winds, the burnt bread was not metaphor, it was survival. Families would retell stories of how a blackened crust kept a baby from wasting away in its cradle, or how the smoke curling from an oven drove a wicked spirit from the barn. Children were taught that if they smelled burnt bread in the air, it meant their neighbors were protecting them. Elders argued over which type of grain produced the most effective stench. Rye, many said, though others swore by sourdough, or even flatbread with goat's milk. There were tales, too, of villagers who failed to perform the ritual, and suffered accordingly, hens that laid no eggs, cows whose milk turned to blood, infants born with the mark of the witch's kiss. In time, as Europe industrialized and belief in witches began to wane, the practice faded. Ovens became cleaner, bread more uniform. Burnt loaves were seen as mistakes, not omens. Supermarkets did not sell blackened rye for spiritual defense, and the knowledge of the ritual became a curiosity, tucked between the pages of forgotten ethnographic journals. But in some remote corners of Europe, echoes of the old ways still linger. You might find, hanging in the rafters of an ancient farmhouse, a loaf so blackened it looks like coal, or a great-grandmother who refuses to bake bread on the equinox without letting one slice catch fire. And if you ask her why, she might only smile and say, to keep them away, as though that explanation alone were enough. Perhaps it is, for in the long story of human fear and faith, sometimes the most ordinary things, like bread, are made extraordinary by the needs of the heart. And sometimes, all it takes to push back the darkness is the smell of something burning. The sleepy librarian who preserved the Roman world beneath the arches of a crumbling basilica in the later years of the Roman Empire. Amid dust motes that drifted like golden ash through sunbeams slanting from fractured domes, sat a figure so quiet, so slow-moving, that even the mice forgot to fear him. He was Flavius, alias Priscus, a librarian of the old imperial capital, a man whose greatest enemies were mildew and boredom, and whose life's mission was not to fight wars or advise emperors, but to copy scrolls. Day after day, year after year, Priscus sat cross-legged in the scriptoria, hunched over cracked wax tablets or rolls of sheepskin parchment, his fingers ink-stained and his robes forever dusted with the fine white grit of decaying marble and fallen plaster. In a city that had once thundered with legionary boots and echoed with the cheers of gladiatorial games, the silence of his chamber rang louder than any triumphal procession. Rome was no longer the empire it had been. The Western court had shifted. To Ravenna, barbarians, bureaucrats, and bishops competed for the crumbling bones of imperial glory. But through it all, Priscus copied, and copied, and copied. He was not fast, nor even particularly neat. His handwriting, while legible, had an almost sleepy curl to it, as if each letter sighed itself into being. His eyes, dulled by decades of squinting, often mistook the letter V for U. And his mind wandered so easily that margin notes in his volumes sometimes included comments like today. I missed lunch, or rain again, same as yesterday. Yet without men like Priscus, much of what we know of the Roman world would have vanished. When senators abandoned the forum and temples fell to ruin, when scrolls turned to ash in Alexandria, or were pulped into paper in Constantinople, it was the sleepy Roman librarians, monks before monks, historians without ambition, who rescued civilization in the most boring way possible, by sitting still and writing things down. Priscus was a creature of habit. He rose at dawn, not because he was disciplined, but because the birds wouldn't let him sleep. He dressed slowly, often forgetting which sandal went on which foot, and made his way to the library with the pace of a bored tortoise. He took his spot by the north window, where the light was gentlest, and worked until midday. Lunch was always the same: a crust of bread, some olives, and whatever was left in the amphora of watered wine. Then he napped, not out of laziness, but because thinking about Cicero's prose could induce a natural coma. In the afternoon, he copied again, dragging his quill like a plow through letters of Livy, Ovid, or Galen. He had no illusions of grandeur. He knew he was not writing new ideas or reshaping the world. He simply wanted the past not to disappear. He once remarked, scribbled between lines of Tacitus, that perhaps the gods love those who sleep. For in sleep we forget to destroy. It was the closest thing to poetry he ever produced. The library itself was no longer grand. Gone were the golden shelves and carved busts of philosophers. The roof leaked in 3 places. Pigeons nested behind the statue of Minerva, and the ink supply was so unreliable that Priscus often had to grind charred bone into oil to keep writing, but he persisted. He copied Roman law codes with a sigh, noting in the margins, still applies, mostly. People never change. He transcribed Caesar's commentaries with little admiration, only adding, very full of himself. And once, in a particularly tired stretch, he accidentally duplicated an entire chapter of Pliny's Natural History, then shrugged and moved on. Priscus rarely spoke. When he did, it was to ask if someone had seen his wax stylus, or if the local baker still had yesterday's bread. Visitors were rare. A bishop once stopped by to examine a theological manuscript and left within minutes, mumbling about dust and pagan nonsense. A Gothic commander, illiterate but curious, offered him a gold brooch in exchange for a scroll he could pretend to read. Priscus gave it to him for free and returned to his Virgil. There was no drama in his life. He had no lovers, no enemies, and no ambition for higher office. Once offered a promotion to palace scribe, he declined on the grounds that the palace had too many stairs. Instead, he stayed where he was, year after year, long after Rome's civic life had died. The aqueducts crumbled, the baths ran dry, the Senate dissolved, but Priscus copied on. When he grew too old to sit upright, he laid on his side and held the scrolls with trembling fingers. When his eyes failed, he dictated from memory, and when his voice faded, he tapped out letters with a stick on the dirt floor for a younger scribe to transcribe. He died in his sleep, appropriately, while curled against a half-finished translation of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. No one held a funeral. No one wrote his name in the annals. But centuries later, medieval scholars puzzling over a strange variation in a Roman text noticed a recurring marginal note. Very windy today, it appeared again and again across different manuscripts, all tracing back to a single sleepy hand. His quiet legacy, unintentionally etched in ink, outlived emperors and kings. Flavius, alias Priscus, the dullest man in Rome, had preserved the voice of a civilization not through war or faith or even brilliance, but through the dull noble art of not giving up. And somewhere, deep in the dusty shelves of forgotten abbeys and distant archives, his sleepy scrawl still lingers. A whisper from a world that refused to vanish simply because one man stayed awake long enough to write it down. When the emperor's beard was a legal matter deep within the echoing marble corridors of the Byzantine court, in a time when saints were painted in gold leaf and theological debates could lead to riots in the streets, There came a moment so utterly absurd, so quietly magnificent in its bureaucratic complexity, that even the court scribes hesitated to put quill to parchment. It involved an emperor, a beard, and the kind of meticulous legal interpretation that only the Byzantines, those unparalleled artisans of administrative overkill, conjure. The emperor in question was Justinian II, known to history as Rhinat Medos, meaning the slit-nosed. His rule, spanning the latter half of the 7th century, was a story of exile, mutilation, miraculous return, and vengeance. But before all the throat-cuttings and military campaigns, before he was deposed, disfigured, and astonishingly restored to power, there existed a quieter version of Justiniana, man obsessed not with empire, but with etiquette, law, and facial hair. The Byzantine court was a place where even silence had protocol, and nothing, absolutely nothing, escaped the reach of imperial regulation. Courtiers' robes were assigned precise hues based on their station. Spoon sizes were debated. In council, there were even rules about how deeply one should bow, depending on the time of day. It was only natural, then, that the emperor's beard should become a legal matter at the time. Beards were not merely fashion statements. They carried deep theological and philosophical weight. In Orthodox thought, beards symbolized wisdom, humility, and a rejection of the vanities of the flesh. Monks were never to shave. Clergy beards were to be full, but not unruly. Laymen were expected to maintain a certain decorum of growth, and the emperor, God's chosen representative on earth, had to embody the balance between regal splendor and ascetic restraint. But Justinian II had a problem. His beard was ... problematic. Some say it was patchy, others that it grew in tufts of red and gold, making him look less like a sovereign and more like a disgruntled badger. Still others whispered that he had once accidentally singed it while examining an incense brazier too closely. Whatever the truth, Justinian became increasingly self-conscious. His courtiers, ever eager to please, began growing their own beards. In carefully sculpted homage, each subtly outmaneuvering the other, with clever cuts and scented oils. The palace soon resembled a competition of whiskered vanity, where statesmen spent more time debating pomade than policy. So Justinian, ever the legislator, did what Byzantine emperors did best. He issued a decree, known unofficially as the facial ordinance. It outlined, in excruciating detail, acceptable forms of facial hair for various members of court. Bishops were to maintain full beards, extending no lower than the clavicle. Senators were permitted a trimmed style, provided no wax was used for curling. Eunuchs, lacking the requisite hormones, were exempt, but required to wear artificial beard. During formal processions, a chamberlain was assigned the role of beard warden, tasked with inspecting compliance, issuing fines, and in one memorable case ordering the forced shaving of an arrogant young noble who had grown a mustache, deemed heretically Western. Yet this was not simply about appearance. In Byzantium, appearance and essence were indivisible. The emperor's beard, and those of his officials, were seen as reflections of divine order. Disobedience was not just insubordination, it was spiritual disorder. One bishop who refused to trim his beard in accordance with the new law claimed he received a vision of St. Basil scowling at him in a dream. He immediately submitted to the barber. Foreign ambassadors from beardless cultures were bemused. One Venetian envoy remarked in a letter that negotiations with the Byzantines now involved more grooming protocol than treaty terms. Another, from the Abbasid Caliphate, was deeply offended when offered a fake beard to wear during a banquet so as not to disturb imperial symmetry. Justinian himself remained devout in his enforcement, despite his own beard still refusing to grow. It was said he would spend hours staring into polished bronze mirrors, attempting to comb it into illusion. One anecdote recounts how he once delayed a council meeting for an hour because he'd discovered a gray hair, and insisted on plucking it himself with golden tweezers designed for relics. Then came the unintended consequences. A faction of bureaucrats, ever adept at exploiting imperial minutiae, began using the beard laws as political weapons. Accusations of unlawful trimming or improper grooming were hurled like theological insults. One minister was demoted after an anonymous tip claimed his beard was dyed with imported walnut paste, not local indigo as required. A short-lived underground market of forbidden beard tonics and illicit styling scrolls sprang up among the scribes. A group of dissenters mockingly called the clean-chinned even began circulating anti-beard pamphlets disguised as psalters. Of course, as with all things in Byzantine politics, the entire beard affair eventually folded into larger court intrigue. Justinian would go on to face rebellion, exile, and disfigurement, only to return with a vengeance that saw his enemies flayed, impaled, or stuffed into barrels. Yet, even after his fall and eventual execution, his beard laws lingered for decades. Afterward, imperial barbers kept copies of the facial ordinance tucked into their belts, just in case. Modern historians look back on this strange moment with a mix of awe and bemusement. It was quintessential Byzantium, a civilization where law, ritual, theology, and sheer absurdity mingled so intimately that even a strand of hair could spark legal discourse. The Byzantine Empire may be gone, its domes and icons weathered by centuries of war and wind. But the tale of the emperor's beard remains a reminder that even in the greatest empires, power can hinge on the most trivial of details, and that sometimes history is written not with swords, but with shaving razors and scented wax. The Pope who outlawed cats in the quiet hush of midnight cloisters and the echoing gloom of Europe's candlelit cathedrals. One might not expect feline footsteps to be a subject of theological concern. And yet, in one of history's stranger edicts, Pope Gregory, the ninth head of the Catholic Church from 1227 to 1241, would forever alter the fate of cats across Christendom. It was a papal decision rooted not in reason, but in fiat, when the emperor's beard was a legal matter deep within the echoing marble corridors of the Byzantine court. In a time when saints were painted in gold leaf and theological debates could lead to riots in the streets, there came a moment so utterly absurd, so quietly magnificent in its bureaucratic complexity, that even the court scribes hesitated to put quill to parchment. It involved an emperor, a beard, and the kind of meticulous legal interpretation that only the Byzantines, those unparalleled artisans of administrative overkill, could conjure. The emperor in question was Justinian II, known to history as Rhinamedos, meaning the slit-nosed. His rule, spanning the latter half of the 7th century, was a story of exile, mutilation, miraculous return, and vengeance. But before all the throat cuttings and military campaigns, before he was deposed, disfigured, and astonishingly restored to power, there existed a quieter version of Justiniana, man obsessed not with empire, but with etiquette, law, and facial hair. The Byzantine court was a place where even silence had protocol, and nothing, absolutely nothing, escaped the reach of imperial regulation. Courtiers' robes were assigned precise hues based on their station. Spoon sizes were debated in council. There were even rules about how deeply one should bow depending on the time of day. It was only natural, then, that the emperor's beard should become a legal matter. At the time, beards were not merely fashion statements. They carried deep theological and philosophical weight. In Orthodox thought, beards symbolized wisdom, humility, and a rejection of the vanities of the flesh. Monks were never to shave. Clergy beards were to be full, but not unruly. Laymen were expected to maintain a certain decorum of growth. And the emperor, God's chosen representative on earth, had to embody the balance between regal splendor and ascetic restraint. But Justinian II had a problem. His beard was ... problematic. Some say it was patchy. Others that it grew in tufts of red and gold, making him look less like a sovereign and more like a disgruntled badger. Still others whispered that he had once accidentally singed it while examining an incense brazier too closely. Whatever the truth, Justinian became increasingly self-conscious. His courtiers, ever eager to please, began growing their own beards. In carefully sculpted homage, each subtly outmaneuvering the other with clever cuts and scented oils. The palace soon resembled a competition of whiskered vanity, where statesmen spent more time debating pomade than policy. So Justinian, ever the legislator, did what Byzantine emperors did best. He issued a decree, known unofficially as the facial ordinance. It outlined, in excruciating detail, acceptable forms of facial hair for various members of court. Bishops were to maintain full beards, extending no lower than the clavicle. Senators were permitted a trimmed style, provided no wax was used for curling. Eunuchs, lacking the requisite hormones, were exempt, but required to wear artificial beardlets. During formal processions, a chamberlain was assigned the role of beard warden, tasked with inspecting compliance, issuing fines, and in one memorable case ordering the forced shaving of an arrogant young noble who had grown a mustache, deemed heretically Western. Yet this was not simply about appearance. In Byzantium, appearance and essence were indivisible. The emperor's beard, and those of his officials, were seen as reflections of divine order. Disobedience was not just insubordination, it was spiritual disorder. One bishop who refused to trim his beard in accordance with the new law claimed he received a vision of St. Basil scowling at him in a dream. He immediately submitted to the barber. Foreign ambassadors from beardless cultures were bemused. One Venetian envoy remarked in a letter that negotiations with the Byzantines now involved more grooming protocol than treaty terms. Another, from the Abbasid Caliphate, was deeply offended when offered a fake beard to wear during a banquet so as not to disturb imperial symmetry. Justinian himself remained devout in his enforcement, despite his own beard still refusing to grow symmetrically. Said he would spend hours staring into polished bronze mirrors, attempting to comb it into illusion. One anecdote recounts how he once delayed a council meeting for an hour because he'd discovered a gray hair, and insisted on plucking it himself with golden tweezers designed for relics. Then came the unintended consequences. A faction of bureaucrats, ever adept at exploiting imperial minutiae, began using the beard laws as political weapons. Accusations of unlawful trimming or improper grooming were hurled like theological insults. One minister was demoted after an anonymous tip claimed his beard was dyed with imported walnut paste, not local indigo as required. A short-lived underground market of forbidden beard tonics and illicit styling scrolls sprang up among the scribes. A group of dissenters mockingly called the clean-chinned even began circulating anti-beard pamphlets disguised as psalters. Of course, as with all things in Byzantine politics, the entire beard affair eventually folded into larger court intrigue. Justinian would go on to face rebellion, exile, and disfigurement, only to return with a vengeance that saw his enemies flayed, impaled, or stuffed into barrels. Yet, even after his fall and eventual execution, his beard laws lingered. For decades afterward, imperial barbers kept copies of the facial ordinance tucked into their belts, just in case. Modern historians look back on this strange moment with a mix of awe and bemusement. It was quintessential Byzantium, a civilization where law, ritual, theology, and sheer absurdity mingled so intimately that even a strand of hair could spark legal discourse. The Byzantine Empire may be gone, its domes and icons weathered by centuries of war and wind. But the tale of the emperor's beard remains a reminder that even in the greatest empires, power can hinge on the most trivial of details, and that, sometimes, history is written not with swords, but with shaving razors and scented wax. Our myth, and the dark currents of medieval superstition. Gregory IX, though pious and politically astute, came to power at a time when Europe trembled beneath waves of plague, heresy, and paranoia. Inquisitions were rising. Heretics were hunted with the same fervor as witches would be centuries later. The line between theology and folklore blurred in dusty villages, where peasants whispered of omens and portents. It was in this context that cats, especially black ones, began to draw unwanted attention. They were graceful, silent, nocturnal, and independent traits that, to the medieval imagination, aligned them unnervingly with the devil himself. Gregory's distrust of cats was likely solidified by a document known as the Vox in Rama, a papal bull issued in 1233. This document, far from a boring ecclesiastical footnote, contained chilling descriptions of alleged satanic rituals that included the worship of a demonic black cat. In these supposed rites, the participants would kiss the creature under its tail and pledge allegiance to evil. The implication was clear. The cat, once revered in ancient Egypt and kept in Roman villas, had become, in the eyes of the Church, a vessel of diabolical power. With this decree, cats, especially black ones, were swept up in a wave of suspicion that would haunt them for centuries. Across Europe, stories spread like wildfire. Cats were familiars of witches. Cats were reincarnated demons. Cats brought misfortune, crop failure, and disease. And so, in towns from Germany to France, mass killings of cats began, sometimes sanctioned by local clergy, sometimes carried out by terrified mobs acting under the unspoken permission of Gregory's bull. The irony, of course, is dark and deep. For by exterminating cats, particularly in urban areas, the medieval world unintentionally created the perfect conditions for the rise of rats. And rats, as history has grimly recorded, were the primary carriers of fleas infected with Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for the Black Death. Though the first major wave of plague wouldn't strike until a century later, in the 1340s. The ecological imbalance set in motion by the Church's anti-cat stance may well have contributed to the unchecked spread of disease when it finally arrived. In a bitter twist of fate, the very animals that could have helped mitigate the devastation were, thanks to papal fear and folklore, already culled in staggering numbers. But the persecution of cats didn't end with Gregory IX. His decree set a precedent, and long after his death, the association between cats and witchcraft endured. During the witch hunts of the 15th to 17th centuries, women suspected of witchcraft were often accused of keeping cats as demonic companions. Trials sometimes included evidence that the accused had spoken with their feline, or that the animal had mysteriously survived where others perished, clearly a sign, they said, of the devil's favor. Meanwhile, cat populations in some parts of Europe remained dangerously low, and this wasn't just an animal rights issue. It altered the rhythms of daily life. Grain stores became more vulnerable to rodent infestation. Farmers fought losing battles against vermin that would once have had a natural predator. Children grew up without the purring presence of lap cats, and the once common sight of cats in Mon. The crusade that never happened, when children tried to reclaim the Holy Land. Imagine, if you will, a dusty square in 13th century France or Germany, filled not with armored knights or papal legates, but with children, some barefoot, some holding crude crosses fashioned from branches, others clutching sacks filled with bread, dried fruit, or keepsakes from home. Their eyes are filled with conviction, not yet tempered by the brutal logic of the adult world. Their mission, nothing less than the liberation of the Holy Land. This wasn't a fairy tale or a folk tale told to frighten village children into obedience. It was a real eventor, perhaps more accurately, a real belief, wrapped in layers of truth, myth, and medieval misunderstanding. It has come to be known as the Children's Crusade of 1212, and it stands as one of the most tragic and bizarre footnotes in the long and blood-stained history of the Crusades. By the early 13th century, the age of the Crusades was already well underway. Armies had marched, cities had fallen, and rivers of blood had been spilled in the name of reclaiming Jerusalem. Yet despite this, the Holy City remained out of Christian hands. The official Crusades were becoming increasingly political, and increasingly brutal, more about power and territory than purity of faith. It's in this atmosphere of disillusionment that the Children's Crusade takes shape, though not as a sanctioned military campaign. It began, according to most accounts, with a boy named Stephen in France and another named Nicholas in Germany. Both were likely in their early teens. Both claimed to have received visions from Christ himself. In these visions, they were told to lead a peaceful army of children to the Holy Land. Their purity, they were told, would succeed where armies had failed. There are variations in the details, depending on the chronicler. Some claim they preached to townsfolk like little prophets. Others say they performed miracles, like healing the blind or calming storms. What we know for certain is that thousands of children responded to their call. It spread not through royal edicts or church proclamations, but by word of mouth, firelight stories, and the undeniable magnetism of youthful conviction. These children believed that the seas would part for them, like they had for Moses, that God would guide their feet to Jerusalem, and that their innocence alone would melt the hearts of Muslim leaders and reclaim Christ's tomb. They marched through villages and towns, picking up followers as they went. Some were truly children, under 12. Others were teenagers, apprentices, and even a few wandering adults who joined, in perhaps moved by belief, or perhaps taking advantage of the naive and the hopeful. The logistics, of course, were a nightmare. Food ran low quickly. disease spread. Many children simply turned back. Others died along the way. In Germany, Nicholas's group made it as far as Italy. In France, Stephen's band reached Marseille. And it's in the ports of southern Europe that the story takes its most heartbreaking turn. According to accounts from the Chronica Regia, Coloniensis, and other medieval sources, merchants in Marseille promised the children ships to the Holy Land. 7 vessels were reportedly provided. But instead of sailing to Jerusalem, these ships went south toward North Africa. The children, it's believed, were sold into slavery in Muslim lands. Some say a storm sank 2 of the ships en route. Others suggest the story was later exaggerated by chroniclers eager to make a cautionary tale of the episode. Still, many of the children were never seen again. The Pope at the time, Innocent III, was initially moved by the children's zeal. He is reported to have said, "These children put us to shame." But he did nothing to aid them. No crusader army was dispatched to rescue the kidnapped youths. No official rebuke was issued to the merchants who had tricked them. In the end, the episode was swept aside, buried under layers of theological debate and political maneuvering. But the tale lived on in sermons, in cautionary tales, and in the darker corners of monastic chronicles. And over time, it became something else, a parable about innocence corrupted, about the perils of unguarded faith, and about how belief without wisdom can be weaponized, or, worse, discarded. Historians today debate the factual accuracy of the Children's Crusade. Some argue that it wasn't truly a crusade in the military sense, nor was it made up entirely of children. It may have been more of a social movement and outpouring of religious hysteria among the disenfranchised, a pilgrimage gone wrong. Still, the central emotional truth remains. In 1212, thousands of the young and innocent truly believed they could change the world by walking across it. And the world, as it so often does, swallowed them whole. The psychological backdrop of the time helps explain how such a strange event could even be conceivable. Medieval Europe was a world where the miraculous and the mundane constantly collided. Angels were as real as bread. Visions weren't scoffed at, they were investigated. And the idea that children, pure and unsullied, could intercede were armored. Men had failed was not absurd, was hopeful. In many ways, the Children's Crusade was not just a product of misplaced faith, but of profound desperation. It was a cry in the dark, a prayer on weary legs, a testament to how the human spirit, no matter how young or ill-equipped, will attempt to reach toward something greater, even when the path is doomed. Today, we are left with only fragments of names, places, and twisted fates. The dusty roads of France and Germany remember none of their footprints. But the story endures, quietly, like a half-sung hymn, not of victory, but of longing. Not of strategy, but of sorrow. For once upon a time, children tried to do what kings and knights could not. And history, as ever, did not wait for them. The curious case of the medieval animal trials, when pigs faced execution step into the courtroom of a small 14th century French village. And you might be surprised, not by the presence of robed clerics or stern-faced magistrates, those were expected, but by the accused, standing in the dock. It snorts, it oinks, it may even be wearing clothes. Because on this particular day, the defendant is a pig, and it is being tried for murder. As bizarre as it may sound to our modern ears, this wasn't some one-off carnival of absurdity. Across medieval Europe, from France to Switzerland to parts of Germany and Italy, animals were genuinely put on trial. They were assigned lawyers. They were cross-examined. They were judged. And if found guilty, they could be whipped, excommunicated, hanged, or even burned at the stake. These were not metaphorical proceedings. They were legal spectacles that sometimes drew crowds, consumed resources, and were recorded with all the solemnity and detail of human trials. The medieval worldview did not draw a sharp moral or judicial line between humans and animals. In fact, many people at the time believed animals, especially domesticated ones, could sin. Not simply act on instinct, but choose wrongdoing, particularly if they were influenced by the devil. The Catholic Church, ever present in all aspects of medieval life, was also a driving force behind this logic. If a pig mauled a child to death, it wasn't merely an animal behaving savagely. It had committed a moral offense, a violation of divine and social order, and thus had to face divine justice. The community's spiritual balance depended on it. The documentation of these trials is both macabre and surprisingly bureaucratic. One of the most famous cases occurred in 1386 in the Norman town of Falaise. A sow was arrested for attacking a young child, who later died from the injuries. The pig was jailed, tried in a court of law, and found guilty. But it didn't stop there. The sow was dressed in a human outfit, complete with a waistcoat and breeches, and paraded publicly before being executed by hanging. The executioner was paid just as he would have been for executing a man, and the account was recorded in meticulous legal French. In other instances, pigs were whipped in public as a form of penance. Oxen, horses, and dogs could also be tried especially if their behavior caused death or disrupted social order. But even more strangely, there were also collective trials, especially of vermin. Rats, for example, were once summoned to court in 15th century France. A group of ecclesiastical lawyers took the matter extremely seriously. The rats were accused of devouring barley, stored in barns, an offense to the local economy and order. A lawyer named Bartholomew Chassigny was appointed to defend them. He argued that his clients, the rats, could not appear in court because they were dispersed over many villages and thus could not safely make the journey without being harmed by cats or people. The judge agreed and rescheduled the hearing. Chassigny's defense was not satire. It launched a long legal career. He later became a respected jurist. These trials served more than just an entertainment or disciplinary function. They were rituals, a way for communities to process tragedy, make sense of disorder, and restore spiritual balance. In an era when life was hard, death was frequent, and disease was inexplicable, the idea that justice could be served even if the offender was a rooster that crowed at the wrong time offered people a form of control. It turned random misfortune into moral narrative. It provided closure. Sometimes these animal trials took on even stranger tones. In Switzerland in the late 15th century, a rooster was tried and condemned to be burned for laying an egg, a rare but possible phenomenon in birds known as a cock egg, since the egg was considered a product of the devil. Used for witchcraft or summoning demons, the rooster was burned alive as a heretic. Similarly, locusts were summoned by monks to vacate a region or face divine wrath. In the ecclesiastical mind, creatures could participate in sin, and so they had to participate in redemption or punishment. The court trials were often divided. Ecclesiastical courts handled creatures thought to be influenced by the devil, like rats or insects, threatening crops, while secular courts took on domestic animals like pigs and cows. Each court had its own rituals, terminology, and process. But both were united by a shared cosmology that said animals were part of the moral web of the world. One might ask, did people really believe animals understood these trials? Possibly not in the way we'd assume, but that wasn't the point. These trials were performative acts with symbolic power. The animal stood in for disorder, for chaos, for death. By punishing it, society reaffirmed its belief in moral order, much like how medieval mystery plays used devils and demons to externalize human temptation. These trials made the abstract visible. In some cases, the trials reflected very real economic concerns. A single pig could be worth months of income for a peasant. If a pig attacked someone, it wasn't just a legal problem, it was a communal and economic issue. Executing the pig symbolized more than justice. It meant the community prioritized human life and order over economic gain. But not all trials ended in punishment. There are recorded cases where animals were acquitted. In one instance, a group of weevils accused of destroying vineyards were represented by legal counsel. And when the court ultimately ruled that the insects could stay in one small part of the land, it reflected not just fairness, but a deeply odd kind of coexistence, a nod to the fact that, even in judgment, life was about balance. Today, we look back on these trials with incredulity or laughter. Surely, it seems, this was just a symptom of a less enlightened age. But perhaps that's too easy. After all, modern societies have their own rituals, lawsuits against corporations that are legal persons, or symbolic gestures that play out in courtrooms and media. Medieval animal trials, though surreal, were a mirror of that society's fears, beliefs, and need for moral structure. They were darkly theatrical, yes, but they were also deeply human. A desperate attempt to make sense of the world when plagues arrived, when crops failed, when a pig mauled a toddler and people needed someone, or something, to blame. The courtroom might have smelled of hay, not mahogany. The defendants might have oinked, instead of pleaded. But the underlying drama, the need to understand, control, and punish what hurt us was as real then as it is now. In the quiet records of these strange proceedings, written in brown ink on parchment scrolls, we glimpse a world that sought justice everywhere, even in the barnyard. The apothecary who prescribed sleep by moonlight has, the sun sank behind the minarets, and the city of Constantinople dimmed into a labyrinth of flickering lanterns. A quiet figure would slip through the alleys and shadowed arcades of the grand bazaar, his sandals whispering against the ancient cobblestones. He carried no sign, no cart, and wore no apron of dyed cloth to mark his trade. Yet the people of the city knew him not by name, but by need. They called him simply the sleep seller. And in the perfumed air of the autumn night, when bakers closed their ovens and sailors curled beneath their sails, he dispensed one of the most sought-after remedies of the age, not gold, not wine, not prayer, but sleep. In a world ruled by politics, plague, prayer, and war, restful sleep was a luxury few could afford. The Sultan's viziers tossed restlessly beneath silk sheets, haunted by dreams of rebellion. Fishermen blinked through salt-stung eyes after endless nights on choppy waters. Mothers paced in silence beside feverish children, counting the seconds between coughs, and within this aching, exhausted empire, the sleep seller moved with a pouch of vials and scrolls, prescribing not pills or powders, but rituals, delicate prescriptions rooted in ancient knowledge, whispered secrets, and a firm belief that sleep, like health, was a ceremony. His remedies were strange and poetic, for those who suffered nightmares. He recommended sleeping beneath sheets, dyed with saffron and anise, herbs known not just for scent, but for their calming metaphysical aura. For insomniacs plagued by racing thoughts, he proposed a bowl of warm goat's milk infused with crushed almonds and a drop of lavender oil, sipped slowly while facing west, the direction, he claimed, where dreams gathered at dusk. But his most famous prescription was something altogether more peculiar: sleep by moonlight. According to his scrolls, many of which he claimed descended from Persian astronomers and Byzantine monks, exposure to moonlight during the early phase of sleep aligned the body's internal rhythm with the lunar tides, soothing both heart and mind. Patients were told to leave their shutters slightly ajar on moonlit nights, to sleep with their heads angled toward the window, and to avoid candles or lanterns that might interrupt the moon's silver gaze. He believed the moon had a cooling influence on the blood, reducing night-heated humors that caused restless tossing and sinister dreams. Whether his theories held true or not, the ritual itself became a cult-like practice among Constantinople's elite. Aristocrats redesigned their sleeping chambers to include moon-facing terraces. Bedchambers were built with arched windows to allow lunar light to fall across pillows like a soft white curtain. Even the harem women of Topkapi Palace were rumored to request moon hours, insisting that their attendants time their rest with the rising of the moon. But the sleep seller's practice extended far beyond these romantic rituals. He also dealt in more tactile, grounded methods of inducing rest. He ground poppy seeds into fine paste, mixed with date syrup, and rubbed onto the soles of feet. He prescribed lullaby rhythms to musicians who played at taverns and hospitals alike, instructing them in Mackham's musical modes, said to mimic the body's descent into slumber. He trained mothers to breathe in specific counts while rocking infants, arguing that the synchronization of maternal breath with a child's heartbeat encouraged sleep more deeply than silence ever could. He maintained that sleep was not merely a passive act, but a sacred state, a doorway between the physical and the unseen. To prepare for it was like preparing for prayer, or de-thrickering cleanliness, intention, and stillness. He was particularly adamant that one should never sleep immediately after eating heavy food or in anger, claiming both led to dark dreams and waking unrest. His notes also warned against sleeping too long past dawn, for to do so was to confuse the angels tasked with observing one's morning prayers. Not everyone believed in his methods. Some doctors dismissed him as a charlatan. and certain imams grumbled that his rituals bore too much resemblance to Zoroastrian or pagan rites. But the people, especially the tired, the grieving, the anxious believed. They spoke of miraculous nights where, after years of sleepless torment, a single moonlit slumber left them renewed, as if touched by a divine hand. Pilgrims, diplomats, and even foreign merchants sought him out, hoping for a tincture, a whisper, or a scroll to carry home. Over time, his reputation crossed borders. In Venice, translated fragments of his sleep scrolls circulated among apothecaries. In Cairo, scribes noted his name sometimes as a man, sometimes as a myth. And in Istanbul, his legacy faded not with scandal or death, but with the quiet replacement of ritual by remedy, of tradition by science. Yet the moon continued to rise, and centuries later, old Ottoman houses still bear crescent windows and moon-angled roofs, architectural echoes of a time when sleep was sacred and moonlight was medicine. In today's age of pills and screens, it is easy to scoff at such ideas. But perhaps, in the dim stillness of a full moon's night, when the air is cool and the world is hushed, one might remember the sleep seller and his silvery creed, that sleep is not a surrender, but a ceremony, and that even in an empire of war and wealth, what people wanted most at the end of the day was rest. The barber who started a blood feud with a teacup in the sweltering lanes of late 17th century Istanbul, where the muezzin's call to prayer mingled with the hammering of tinsmiths and the laughter of children, chasing shadows in spice-scented bazaars, there existed a seemingly unremarkable man who became infamous not through rebellion or revelation, but because of an unassuming teacup. His name was Haki Effendi, a barber whose shop sat snugly between a pickle seller and a parchment vendor near the Yeni Cami, and whose legacy would ripple through neighborhoods in what came to be known, absurdly, as the porcelain conflict. Now, barbering in the Ottoman Empire was a respectable trade, requiring not just skill with scissors and razors, but an ability to listen, to speak wisely, and to manage the often tempestuous egos of local clientele. A barber was therapist, gossip broker, physician, and, in many neighborhoods, judge of petty disputes. Haki Effendi was especially good at this. He was a lean man with a silver-threaded beard, known for his basil-scented rosewater cologne, and his almost priestly calm. Men would line up at dawn, not just to have their beards trimmed, but to tell Haki their grievances about landlords, lazy nephews, or ungrateful wives. His shop was always humming with talk, laughter, and the occasional political whisper. But all of this serenity shattered the day a certain teacup was cracked-not chipped. Not broken, but ever so slightly fractured in the presence of a man named Farabe, a proud merchant who imported textiles from Aleppo and drank his tea like a ceremony. Farabe had brought the teacup as a gift. It was a delicate Chinese porcelain piece, hand-painted with lotus flowers and cranes, which he claimed had survived 2 pirate raids and the wrath of a jealous caravan leader. When he offered it to Haki, it was with the sort of performative generosity that implies a debt has been created. Haki, gracious but shrewd, accepted the gift and placed it in his shop's wooden display case, nestled among old coins and antique razors. For a time, the cup sat undisturbed. But one morning, during a heated discussion between 2 barbershop regulars about the relative merits of Persian versus Egyptian poetry, a young apprentice named Sem, reaching for a rag, bumped the shelf ever so slightly. The teacup trembled and tipped, producing a thin spider-webbed crack along its base. When Farabe arrived later that week and saw the damage, his mood turned sour. He said little, but his silence was thunderous. The next day, he began speaking ill of Hak's professionalism to his merchant friends. Soon, rumors began to spread that Haki had grown careless, that he was more interested in stories than in scissors, and perhaps he had become too friendly with certain political dissidents who whispered treason between mustache snips. Haki, stunned and wounded, attempted to apologize. He even offered to replace the teacup with a similar piece, though where one was to find an identical artifact from the Kangxi dynasty in a back alley of Istanbul was unclear. Farah refused the offer and began patronizing a rival barber 2 streets over, a man named Veli who trimmed beards like he was sawing rope and left men bleeding but appeased. Farhat's need for dramatic vengeance. Other merchants followed. Within weeks, Hack's shop had lost nearly half its regular clientele. But it didn't stop there. One evening, the pickle vendor next door, emboldened by the lull in traffic, expanded his cart into the alley near Hack's front steps. Hacky, usually mild, protested. An argument erupted, witnessed by a crowd. And the pickle vendor claimed Hacky had insulted the prophet, an accusation as serious as it was false. Though the accusation didn't stick, the whispers lingered. In retaliation, Hacky wrote an anonymous poem that circulated through the coffee houses. A scathing allegory about a gourd who thought himself a sultan. Everyone knew it mocked the pickle seller, who promptly responded by bribing a janissary officer to fine Hacky for blocking public walkways with his customers' stools. It spiraled. The parchment seller complained about the scent of Hack's oils drifting into his ink, calling it a corruption of sacred scripture. Hacky was forced to defend himself in the local magistrate's office more than once, his hands stained with shaving soap, his soul weary. But the teacup remained. Despite everything, Hacky kept it on the shelf, cracked but visible as if to say, "This is where it began." In the 4th year of this absurd feud, a fire broke out in the market. Dozens of stalls were destroyed. Miraculously, Hack's shop survived with only soot marks and broken shutters. The teacup, once again, had cracked, this time split clean in two. Hacky stared at the broken halves for a long time, then quietly buried them behind the mosque courtyard at dawn. He didn't tell anyone. In time, the feud faded. The pickle vendor died of indigestion. The parchment seller retired to Bursa, even Farabe, now gout-ridden and bitter, was seen asking an apprentice about Hack's prices one morning, though he never stepped inside. Hacky, older now and content with fewer customers, continued to shave and listen and speak in low tones. But those who entered his shop would occasionally notice a faint, lotus-like design carved into a new teacup that sat on the shelf, not as a boast or an offering, but perhaps as a warning, a quiet reminder of how a single fracture in porcelain could ripple through lives and entire neighborhoods. And in the tea-houses of old Istanbul, whenever someone spoke too loudly or mocked a gift too harshly, an elder might murmur, "Careful, or you'll start a porcelain war." History has its empires of steel, its dynasties of blood, but sometimes it also remembers a barbershop feud over a teacup that cracked the peace of a city more deeply than any sword. The sultan who collected obsessions instead of empires in the warm, cinnamon-scented evenings of early 17th century Istanbul, when the mosques glowed with the fading sunlight and merchants rolled up their rugs after a day of bargaining. Whispers fluttered through the Ottoman palace like smoke trailing through ornate grills. Whispers not of war or empire, but of something far more puzzling. Sultan Ibrahim, I once titled the Mad, sat on the throne, but instead of wielding the scimitar of conquest or signing decrees for military expeditions, he seemed consumed with fur. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, but quite literally. Fur beaver, sable, ermine, fox filled his dreams, haunted his senses, and occupied his waking thoughts. He caressed it obsessively, buried his fingers in it, draped it across his robes, and demanded that his courtiers cover palace furniture in it. He even requested that fish be wrapped in it before being served to him. But fur was just the beginning. Ibrahim was not so much a ruler as a collector of strange desires. His obsessions were erratic, unpredictable, and entirely untethered to the grand machinery of Ottoman power. One month, he would demand women with impossibly specific features to be brought to his harem, one with golden eyebrows like a Persian painting, another whose voice reminded him of a song he once heard through a fountain. The next, he would order a search across the empire for a giant melon that had appeared in a dream, convinced that finding it would bring divine visions. When the courtiers failed to produce it, he threatened to drown his viziers. His moods swung like the Bosphorus tides. At dawn, he might weep into his silks because a pigeon had not returned to his windowsill. By noon, he might command the execution of 10 people for disloyalty based on the trembling of their voices. His paranoia coiled tight around his mind like a snake that refused to sleep. He feared conspiracies, shadows, and unseen plots. At one point, he ordered all cats in the palace executed, certain they were spies sent by foreign powers. Even his courtiers, hardened by decades of imperial drama, began to walk with hesitant steps, unsure what strange decree might emerge next. But amid the chaos, one obsession would come to define him more than any other. A concubine named Becker, nicknamed Sugar Cube, a woman of extraordinary charm and political cunning. She arrived in his harem like a perfume the Sultan couldn't stop inhaling. She understood his moods, fed his fantasies, and most importantly, knew how to manipulate them. Under her influence, Ibrahim elevated her family members, showered her in gifts, and let her whisper names into his ear, names of rivals who suddenly found themselves imprisoned or exiled. In a kingdom whose laws once flowed from the Prophet and the Caliphate, things now moved according to the whims of a sultan wrapped in fur, and the gaze of a woman who understood his madness. At her request, Ibrahim once threw bags of gold from the palace windows into the streets, believing it would bless the rain. On another day, she convinced him that the empire's problems stemmed from the sea itself, prompting him to send scribes to write prayers and float them on olive oil across the waves. While the bureaucracy crumbled and armies muttered about delayed pay, the Sultan remained in a velvet fog of indulgence. His paranoia deepened. His brother, princes, and trusted advisors were all watched by spies. The slightest misstep, a bow too short, a whisper too long, could trigger accusations of treason. And yet, the empire endured, not through the will of Ibrahim, but in spite of him. Viziers quietly forged documents, governors ignored his letters, and Janissary commanders negotiated among themselves to hold the borders. Eventually, the strain snapped. In 1648, after years of growing instability, the Janissaries and ulama staged a coup. The empire could no longer afford to be ruled by fantasy. Ibrahim was seized, dragged from the palace he had turned into a playground of compulsions, and imprisoned. A week later, by decree of the ruling council, he was executed, strangled with a silken cord in the traditional Ottoman manner, dignified even in death. His body was wrapped in simple linen, free of fur, and interred with the sultans who had carved empires from desert and forest. In the shadows of his reign, the empire had suffered, but it had also revealed something more enduring, that even the mightiest system could bend beneath the weight of a single man's illusions. Ibrahim's story is not merely one of madness, but of what happens when power no longer sees the world as it is. He ruled with emotion, obsession, and disjointed vision, not malice perhaps, but certainly not law. And yet his legacy lingers. In hushed Ottoman chronicles, his name is uttered, not with venom, but with an almost poetic sorrow. The Sultan who drowned in silks, the ruler who loved textures more than treaties, the monarch who wanted the world to make sense in the shape of fur and fragrance, but who found instead that the world, like sanity, was always just out of reach. The cardinal who loved like a king, but prayed like a politician in the cool corridors of 17th century France, beneath the vast painted ceilings of opulent chateaux and the glimmer of golden candelabras, there walked a man who wore scarlet, not for martyrdom, but for mastery. Cardinal Richelieu, born Armand Jean Duplessis, was no ordinary churchman, and certainly not the sort to be found lost in prayer among dusty reliquaries. He was a man of delicate hands and deadly whispers, of precise Latin and calculated cruelty, a prince of the church who maneuvered through the world of kings not as a servant of God, but as a craftsman of power. But beyond the treaties, the council rooms, and the endless court intrigues that marked his tenure as chief minister to King Louis XIII, Richelieu harbored another ambition, one that lay not in scripture or diplomacy, but in the realm of possession. He desired, fiercely and without apology, to be loved, not abstractly, not from afar, but deeply, privately, in ways no robe or rank could quite explain. He surrounded himself with favorites, young men of striking appearance and refined intelligence whom he elevated, praised, and protected with an almost paternal devotion. Though celibate by office, he was far from cold, and his chambers often echoed with the quiet clink of wine glasses and the murmur of conversations too intimate for politics. The line between affection and power was always blurred with Richelieu, who offered promotions not simply for loyalty, but for emotional fidelity. His letters to some of these men, filled with poetic turns of phrase, spiritual longing, and carefully cloaked passions, suggested more than strategy. There was a kind of yearning in Richelieu, not just to rule France, but to be indispensable to someone, to have his heart echoed back in the eyes of another. To those close to him, the great cardinal was a contradiction, in public. He was the cold architect of France's centralization, the suppressor of noble rebellions, the sponsor of spies and shadow assassins. But in private, he hosted salons, thick with perfume and laughter, where music softened the harsh edges of statecraft, and trust was measured in gestures rather than oaths. He famously clashed with Queen Anne of Austria, not merely out of policy differences, but because he sensed that her influence over the king might rival his own. There was, in his rivalry with the queen, a strange personal bitterness, as if he saw her not only as a political threat, but as an emotional competitor. Louis XIII, delicate and often withdrawn, leaned on Richelieu, not only for governance, but for guidance, and perhaps for the kind of intimate companionship the king found hard to forge elsewhere. Though their relationship was formally proper, some observers noted the way Richelieu addressed the king with flourishes that bordered on the romantic, or at least on the deeply possessive. Behind every order, every edict sealed with crimson wax, there pulsed an emotional drama, invisible to the public, but known to those who understood court life. Richelieu once had a rival banished, not because he had committed treason, but because he had laughed too long in the presence of a man Richelieu cherished. Another was quietly removed after gaining too much admiration from the king. In his mind, France was not only a kingdom to be governed, but a stage upon which his affections must be protected. But Richelieu was also a performer, and his greatest act was convincing the world that he was only a cardinal, that he wore red solely for religious symbolism, and that the tremor in his voice was from age, not from love withheld. He built churches, but also prisons. He funded the arts, but censored the poets who mocked his policies. He championed reason, yet harbored superstitions that made him keep certain relics near his heart. His bedchamber, for all its elegance, held one curious item on his writing table, a worn miniature of a man whose name was never recorded. Its paint faded from years of handling. The cardinal, for all his genius, never married, never publicly loved, and died surrounded by priests, but not, some say, by friends. His final days were marked not by reflection, but by worry, as if he feared being forgotten or In a quiet moment near the end, he reportedly asked his confessor not whether he had served God well, but whether France would remember him with respect. The confessor, perhaps caught off guard, replied that history would do as it pleased, and, indeed, it has. Richelieu remains a giant in France's past, a name taught in textbooks, a man credited with shaping the modern state, but rarely explored for his more intimate ambitions. He did not seek kingship, yet he ruled like a monarch. He did not marry, yet his heart was rarely idle. He did not fight battles on horseback, yet he conquered through papers and persuasion. In the end, he was a cardinal not of faith, but of feeling, one who desired order in politics, and perhaps chaos in love, though he could never allow the latter to bloom fully. His legacy is a palace of mirrors, grand, immaculate, yet filled with shadows that hint at stories untold. As you drift further into sleep, imagine Richelieu once again in his study, quill in hand, composing another decree by candlelight, his gaze occasionally slipping to that small portrait beside his inkstand. The flames flicker, the walls breathe. With silence, and outside the palace, France waits, unknowingly shaped by a man whose robe was heavy with both ambition and longing. Section 15. When the blacksmith dared to innovate, and everyone lost their minds over a curved nail-in, a world where tradition ruled every corner of daily life. The blacksmith lived at the crossroads of innovation and suspicion. He was not a priest, nor a noble, nor a scholar, yet he played a role just as consequential, and sometimes more tangible, in the lives of those around him. For the blacksmith, invention often began not with lofty ideals, but with necessity. A bent hinge that refused to close properly, a plow blade that cracked under pressure, or a constant complaint from the carpenter about square-headed nails, splitting timber. These were the catalysts for change. But any deviation from what had been handed down through generations was met with equal parts curiosity and fear. The day the blacksmith introduced a curved nail, slightly hooked at the end, to better anchor beams in the high winds of storm season. It was as if he had publicly challenged the gods. The village carpenter squinted at the nail like it was possessed. The reeve, having heard rumors that the smith was making strange iron, visited under the pretense of ordering horseshoes, but kept steering the conversation toward the suspicious new design. The blacksmith explained it plainly. The curved shape increased grip in oak beams, reducing structural failure. It wasn't magic. It was simple physics, though he wouldn't have called it that. But physics had no name in the minds of the villagers. What had a name was tradition, and tradition did not include curly-headed nails. Whispers swirled like chimney smoke. Some said the forge had grown hotter than usual, that the fire glowed a strange hue when the nail was made. Others feared the curved nail might anger the spirits who watched over their homes, believing that deviating from ancestral methods invited bad luck, or worse, divine retribution. One old widow refused to let her barn be repaired using the snake, as they were quickly dubbed, convinced they would bring plague upon her goats. Yet as storms rolled in and the curved nails proved to hold beams firmer than before, attitudes, slowly, very slowly, began to shift. But the blacksmith's experience was not a singular one. Across Europe, even the smallest of innovations in smithing met with suspicion. The introduction of crucible steel, better bellows, water-powered hammers, all were once considered risky, even dangerous. In some regions, smiths who used mysterious techniques were accused of sorcery, and in extreme cases, imprisoned, or, worse. For a man who dared to innovate, the line between respected craftsman and feared outcast was razor-thin. The blacksmith had to walk it carefully, understanding when to introduce a change and when to disguise it as something old. He would sometimes pretend his new hinge design was found in the ruins of an older manor, or that a certain blade curve came from a tale his grandfather told. This way, he could cloak the new in the illusion of the ancient, a necessary deception. In a world that distrusted the future, but not all change could be so cleverly masked. When the blacksmith began experimenting with reusing broken tools by melting them down, an early form of metal recycling, centuries ahead of its time, he was met with confusion and even quiet contempt. Why repair what was broken? They asked. The iron has failed once, it's cursed. He would gently explain that the fault was in the tool's form, not its substance. Good iron deserved a second life. Still, many refused tools made from twice-dead metal. They wanted only iron born pure and new from the belly of the earth. Not something repurposed from a shattered hoe or a snapped chisel. But the blacksmith persisted, not out of defiance, but from necessity. Iron was expensive. Smelting required charcoal, which meant chopping forests, which meant labor and transport and time. Reusing metal saved resources, a practical truth that only began to gain traction when crop failures and war made new materials scarce. Eventually, when scarcity tightened its grip and fields went unplowed for want of good tools, villagers began to look more kindly upon the reborn iron. The blacksmith was no prophet or philosopher, but he understood deeply that society clung to what was familiar, not always because it was better, but because it was safer. Change meant risk, and risk threatened stability. He saw it in the eyes of every customer who asked for the usual, and in the fearful glance when he handed over something subtly new. So he began crafting in pairs, one in the old style, one in the new, letting people choose. Most took the old, but sometimes a young farmer or a curious cooper would try the new, and when it held up better, the blacksmith gained a quiet, cautious ally. This was how progress crept into the village, not in revolutions, but in hesitant steps, in tools accepted not because they were different, but because they worked. Still, the blacksmith paid a price. He had fewer friends than most. Gossip followed him like soot on his shoulders. The priest occasionally warned against playing too much with God's fire, and once even preached a sermon vaguely targeting those who twist the iron in ways it was never meant to go. And yet, when the priest's bell cracked and needed recasting, who did he come to? The blacksmith, of course. When the Reeves gate lock failed in a storm, it was the smith who designed a sturdier one. When the mayor's own cartwheel broke on a pilgrimage, the curved nail held the spoke together until they reached the abbey. In the end, it was results that mattered, not beliefs, not suspicion, not even tradition. And so the blacksmith continued. His quiet rebellion against stagnation, each nail and blade a silent argument for thoughtful change. He never demanded recognition. He didn't need a statue or even a mention in the village records. His satisfaction lay in the work itself, in the idea that something he made, something improved by his hands and mind, might make life just a bit easier for someone else. That was legacy enough. The curved nail remained. Eventually, it was no longer called strange. It simply became the way nails were made. And the memory of that first raised eyebrow, that first fearful whisper, faded into smoke, the kind that drifted lazily from a forge, just after a nail was struck, cooled, and ready to be used in a world inching ever so slowly forward. In some English manorial roles, widows who had inherited their husband's tools were permitted to run the forge for a limited time, but only until a male relative or apprentice could take over. And that's not to mention the religious layers of judgment. Blacksmiths were sometimes suspected of having infernal knowledge. The combination of fire, transformation of metal, and strange substances used in tempering like urine or blood gave rise to suspicions that smiths were sorcerers or alchemists. In some parts of Europe, particularly rural France or Germany, a blacksmith's forge might double as a place of folk medicine or even low-level exorcisms, especially since metal amulets were believed to ward off evil. But that meant that if anything went wrong in the village, a horse going lame, a crop failing, a child falling ill, people might blame the smith. You were one mistake away from being accused of sorcery or sabotage, and yet everyone needed you. It was a double-edged sword, indispensable but mistrusted, respected but feared, physically strong but always on the edge of collapse. And even if you worked for a noble household, making their suits of armor or ceremonial swords, you were still considered a manual tradesman, not a man of rank. Your beautiful craftsmanship might one day help win a battle, but you would never be invited to dine at the same table as the knight who wielded your blade. You lived in the margins of mud and coal dust, warming your hands not by wealth or prestige, but by the glow of your anvil's fire. There were good days, of course, days when the metal bent just right, when the shoe fit the horse perfectly, when your tongs didn't slip and your hammer struck true. Days when your neighbors came by not to accuse you of ruining their crops, but to thank you for fixing their cartwheel. Days when the boy you trained got his first burn and didn't cry, and you smiled quietly because he was learning the way you did. But those moments were rare. Mostly, it was relentless. Smoke in your lungs, noise in your ears, grit in your eyes, and always the smell of iron, like blood, like war, like the weight of things no one else wanted to carry. And through it all, the blacksmith kept going, because the village couldn't function without him, because he was needed, even if never celebrated, because that's what strength looked like back then. Not glory on the battlefield, but staying upright when your world was made of ash, heat, and hammering silence. The life of a medieval blacksmith's apprentice was no easier than that of the master himself, and perhaps in some ways it was even more humbling. While the blacksmith carried the burden of production, responsibility, and reputation, the apprentice bore the heavy load of learning under duress, often beginning their training as early as the age of 10 or 12. These boys, for it was almost always boys, would be bound by contract, sometimes signed by their parents, agreeing to live and work under the blacksmith for up to 7 years. The day they stepped into the forge for the first time, they left behind their world of games and chores and entered a realm of blistering heat, blistered hands, and the slow, methodical grind of mastering a trade through sheer repetition. At first, the apprentice did not touch iron at all. His early duties were those of a servant, fetching water, sweeping ash, cutting kindling, carrying loads of coal, oiling tools, and tending to the bellows with aching arms. He slept in a straw-filled sack in the corner of the forge, or in an adjacent shack, his face perpetually smudged with soot, his clothes stiff with grime. The roar of the forge became his lullaby, the hiss of water on hot steel, his alarm clock. The blacksmith rarely coddled his apprentice, for the work itself was teacher enough. Orders came curtly. More coal, fan the fire, hold this, now. The boy learned not to flinch when sparks stung his arms, or when tongs snapped hot metal, just inches from his face. He learned to observe without asking too many questions, to mimic the movements of the master, to notice the angle of a swing, the rhythm of a blow, the color of iron as it glowed, red, orange, and white. The apprentice's hands developed not just from handling tools, but from gripping wooden pails, pushing bellows, and hauling heavy chunks of iron from storage. Mistakes were inevitable, and they hurt, sometimes physically. A misstep could lead to a searing burn, a misplaced hammer swing to a bruised thumb. A moment's inattention to molten metal might cost a lifetime of scarring. But such while painful, were often considered part of the learning process. There was no room for sentimentality in the forge. Pain taught quickly and effectively. Over time, the apprentice earned the right to assist more directly. He might be allowed to strike iron with a small hammer under the master's guidance, or cut pieces of bar stock to size. If he proved steady, he might be given the chance to form simple nails, or punch holes into horseshoes. Each new task was a test of readiness. The blacksmith watched closely, not just for skill, but for discipline, temperament, and resilience. An apprentice who lost his temper or grew careless might be dismissed, his training cut short, his future uncertain. There was no formal schooling, no written curriculum. Every lesson came through demonstration, memory, muscle, and error. But slowly, day by day, month by month, the boy became more than a boy. His posture changed. His arms grew stronger. His eyes learned to read the heat of metal and the weight of silence between hammer blows. His ears tuned into the pitch of steel. His sense of time became bound to the forge's rhythm, not to the sun or the bells of the church. And as his apprenticeship neared its end, the young man might be tasked with forging a masterpiece, not in the modern sense of beauty or elegance, but as a test piece to demonstrate he had mastered the foundational skills of the trade. This item, be it a blade, a tool, or a set of nails and fittings, would be examined by the master and possibly other craftsmen. If it passed muster, the apprentice would be declared a journeyman, free to leave and work under his own name, though rarely with the means to establish his own forge. Most journeymen traveled from town to town, finding temporary work in forges and workshops, saving what coin they could until they might one day return and set up shop. But the road of the journeyman was as harsh and uncertain as the forge, filled with long nights in unfamiliar places, bitter competition, and the constant pressure to prove one's worth in a field already crowded with seasoned smiths. Many journeymen never became masters. Some settled into permanent roles as hired smiths. Others changed trades altogether, broken by the grind of the work or drawn elsewhere. A few, in rare cases, rose to prominence, forging weapons for lords or crafting ironwork so fine it bore their personal marks. But the transition from apprentice to master was never guaranteed. It was a slow ascension built not on talent alone, but on the scars, sweat, and stubborn endurance forged in the darkest corners of the smithy. And though the apprentice rarely received praise, and often endured years of invisible toil, he was the seed from which the next generation of blacksmiths grew. His hands, though uncelebrated, would one day hold the hammer that rang in the next era of iron. Life outside the forge did not offer the medieval blacksmith much in the way of relief, either. While the fire may have cooled when the hearth was extinguished for the night, the weight of the trade followed him home. In many cases, the blacksmith lived adjacent to or above his workshop, meaning there was never truly a separation between labor and leisure. His ears, used to the rhythm of hammer and bellows, remained alert for the cries of townsfolk needing urgent repairs, a farmer whose plow broke at dusk, a guardsman with a snapped sword, a traveler's wagon with a dislodged axle. Rest was often interrupted, and even sleep became an extension of service. Meals, too, were simple and practical. The blacksmith and his family might eat coarse bread, pottage made of root vegetables, or salted meats, hearty food to match the demands of the body. On occasion, a local noble or merchant might pay in game or wine, but more often than not, their payment came in barter. Sacks of grain, woolen cloth, a pair of chickens. Money was less common than debts and promises. The blacksmith's wife, if he had one, often helped in the running of the business. She might handle accounts, organize orders, maintain the family's domestic needs, and even assist with lighter forge tasks like polishing tools or preparing materials. In rural areas especially, blacksmithing could be a family enterprise, with sons apprenticing under their father and daughters pitching in where needed. Yet even in towns, the blacksmith remained something of a paradox. He was respected and relied upon, but not truly elevated in social rank. He rubbed shoulders with nobility only through necessity, not kinship. While lords and knights trusted him with their weapons, they would not dine with him. He was often caught in the gray space between peasant and guildsman, between craftsman and tradesman. The church, ever watchful over morality and labor, had mixed feelings about blacksmiths. On one hand, the forge was a place of honest toil, and many saints were venerated for working with their hands. On the other hand, the blacksmith's tools and fires were reminiscent of the infernal, the clang of hammers echoing like the tortures of hell, the glow of coals likened to damnation. Some towns held superstitions about blacksmiths, attributing them with mysterious powers due to their ability to transform cold, lifeless metal into deadly weapons or intricate locks. In tales whispered by candlelight, blacksmiths were sometimes sorcerers in disguise, alchemists who tamed fire or made deals with the devil. Children were told not to enter a forge alone, lest they be turned to iron statues or cursed by the blackened smith. These stories, while fanciful, reflect the aura of mystery and suspicion that sometimes clung to the trade. And yet, despite all these burdens, the blacksmith often found a quiet pride in his work. There was satisfaction in the swing of the hammer, in the hiss of steel cooled in water, in the heft of a finished item that would serve its owner for years. He might never write a book or hold court, but he knew that his tools plowed the fields, that his nails held roofs above heads, that his hinges swung the doors of churches, homes, and prisons alike. His mark, though hidden, was everywhere. The seasons governed the smith's workload, with winter being both a reprieve and a hardship. Cold made the forge harder to heat, the iron more brittle, and the air cruel on raw hands. But it was also the time when fewer fields needed tilling and more tools needed repair. Winter brought indoor tasks, sharpening blades, reforging broken items, maintaining weapons in preparation for spring campaigns. It also brought the threat of illness, as respiratory problems from forge smoke compounded with the chill. Still, the blacksmith endured, coughing through the soot, warming his feet near the embers, thankful at least that the work continued when other trades grew idle. The blacksmith's children, if they were healthy, might carry on the trade. Sons could be trained, and if they proved capable, they could inherit the forge. Daughters were often married off, but in some cases they learned the trade as well, especially if there were no male heirs. There are records of women running smithies after their husbands' deaths, often with great competence, yet it was still rare, and the work was grueling enough that many families prayed for strong boys. As the years passed, the blacksmith aged faster than his years. His back stooped, his hands curled into arthritic claws, his lungs wheezed. The hammer that once danced now felt like a millstone. Apprentices he once barked at might now offer him a stool or take over the forge entirely, and when he finally passed, whether of smoke-choked lungs, an infection from a burn, or simply the slow extinguishing of strength, he was laid to rest without fanfare. No monuments marked his grave, no songs sung his name. But in the town square, the tools he made continued to carve wood and build homes. His hinges creaked open for weddings and swung shut for burials. His iron gates stood firm against storms, and long after his bones returned to dust, his legacy lived on, not in marble or ink, but in the weight and purpose of iron forged by his hands. Despite the daily grind of soot, sweat, and silent exhaustion that defined the life of a medieval blacksmith, there were moments, however brief or quietly felt, when the work carried something close to reverence. Not merely the kind of satisfaction that came from knowing a plow blade was sharpened or a wheel hub repaired, but the kind that touched on something deeper, even sacred. The shaping of iron from raw or two-tool was, for some blacksmiths, a meditation, a rhythm of heat, hammer, and breath that kept the mind focused and still. The forge, for all its roaring chaos, could become a kind of sanctuary. The blacksmith, standing with tongs in one hand and hammer in the other, often fell into a trance-like state, especially after years of practice. The repetition of movement, bellows, wheeze, anvil clang, iron twist became as natural as breathing. This trance wasn't always romantic or peaceful, of course. Sometimes it was purely mechanical, a result of fatigue or routine. But there were smiths who spoke of feeling, in the act of forging, like they were channeling something older than themselves. Iron had long been seen as a mystical material in European folklore, a substance capable of warding off evil, repelling fairies, and anchoring the spiritual to the physical. Horseshoes were nailed above doors, not merely for luck, but to keep malicious spirits at bay. Iron keys and blades were buried with the dead to protect them or guide them. When a blacksmith drew out glowing red iron and gave it shape, he was, in the eyes of many, performing a kind of earthly magic. For this reason, blacksmiths were sometimes approached for more than tools. Rural villagers, especially in less literate or isolated areas, might bring charms, heirlooms, or strange tokens to the forge, asking the smith to bless them with fire. They might request an old amulet be reheated and reshaped to strengthen its power. Some might believe that passing a sick child's clothing through the smoke of the forge could drive out illness. While not every smith indulged such beliefs, many tolerated them, especially if it helped maintain good standing with the community. These superstitions served a second purpose. They kept the smith's neighbors just distant enough. While they respected his skill, they also feared, or at least misunderstood, the power he seemed to hold. This tension added a certain loneliness to the blacksmith's existence. He was necessary but never entirely embraced. Children might peer into the workshop with curiosity, but they rarely played nearby. Adults might nod in greeting, but few lingered for conversation. His closest companions were often apprentices, and even they came and went over the years. Apprenticeship itself was a grueling multi-year commitment that demanded loyalty, strength, and patience. A boy who wished to become a blacksmith, usually between the ages of 10 and 14, would be apprenticed to a master smith, often for a period of 7 years or more. During this time, he would not be paid, except in food, lodging, and the privilege of learning the craft. He would begin with the most menial tasks, fetching water, pumping bellows, cleaning tools, and sweeping ash. Only gradually would he be allowed to handle iron, first under close supervision, then eventually on his own. A skilled apprentice could become a journeyman, traveling to other towns to hone his skills, eventually earning the right to open his own forge. But few ever made it that far. Many dropped out, injured themselves, or found the life too hard to continue. For those who did persist, the reward was independence, the ability to earn a living through skill and endurance. And yet even master blacksmiths struggled. Competition in towns could be fierce, especially as urban guilds began to exert influence. These guilds, often sanctioned by the crown or the church, regulated trade by controlling who could sell what, at what price, and under what conditions. A blacksmith not in a guild might be fined, harassed, or forced to close his shop. In return for membership, the guild offered protection, access to clients, and the ability to train apprentices, but also demanded dues, attendance at meetings, and strict adherence to rules. For rural smiths, far from such institutions, survival depended more on reputation and resilience. Word of mouth was everything. A single broken axle, an ill-fitted horseshoe, or a snapped blade could ruin one's name. Conversely, crafting a particularly fine sword or reliable plow could secure the smith's business for years. Still, the best advertising was simple consistency. If the townspeople knew that the blacksmith's hinges never warped, that his nails didn't rust, and that his horseshoes held firm across muddy fields, they returned, not out of admiration, but necessity. The blacksmith became as invisible as he was essential. His presence was assumed, like the turning of the seasons or the ringing of the church bell. The irony, perhaps, was that the more dependable his work, the less he was noticed. People cursed their tools when they failed, but rarely thanked the hands that forged them when they worked. And in this quiet thanklessness lay a peculiar kind of dignity, the dignity of purpose without praise. Over time, the tools the blacksmith used became worn not just from use, but from generations of passage. A hammer might be passed from father to son, its handle smoothed by years of sweat. An anvil might bear the marks of 100 blades. These were not objects to be discarded, but revered. Some blacksmiths even developed rituals around their tools, whispering blessings before lighting the fire, tapping the anvil thrice before each session, or hanging particular charms above the forge. Whether these were born of superstition or simple routine, they gave shape to a life that otherwise flowed in a blur of labor. Visitors to the forge often remarked on the strange beauty of the space, the glowing heart of the coals, the rhythmic ringing, the spray of sparks, the sudden hiss as red-hot metal kissed water, for all its grime and noise. There was something undeniably theatrical about the smithy, a small stage where transformation was made visible. In an age when change was slow and invisible, watching iron bend beneath a hammer's will offered a rare glimpse of control, mastery, and power. The blacksmith, however tired, however overlooked, was in that moment a kind of silent artist, shaping not just metal, but the rhythm of life around him. Of your script, written in a single continuous paragraph, exactly as you require. The forge, while unquestionably the blacksmith's realm, was not always the private, soot-streaked sanctuary it is often imagined to be. In truth, it was more of a stage, and sometimes even a sideshow, particularly during fair days, religious festivals, or visits from nobility. At such times, villagers and passers-by would gather near the smithy not merely to watch iron be molded, but to gossip, to haggle, to flirt, to listen to the curious music of hammer-meeting metal, and even to witness demonstrations of unusual skill from the blacksmith himself. If a blade could be shaped in a single heat, or if a horseshoe could be twisted into a knot while still glowing orange, it was a marvel, an act of elemental theater that mixed strength and sorcery in equal measure. Children would peer through the smoke with wide eyes, convinced they were seeing a kind of wizard at work, and indeed, there were many who believed blacksmiths had dealings with spirits, with fire elementals, or with ancient beings that whispered through the coals. In some towns, it was said that the smith could drive away evil spirits with a clang of his hammer, or that no ghost would cross a threshold if the door's hinges had been made by an honest forge. These beliefs weren't just idle superstition, were part of a complex web of folk knowledge and community reverence that put the blacksmith in a strange position, half laborer, half mystic. This reputation came with a burden. A blacksmith couldn't afford to show fear in his own domain. Even if the flames jumped strangely one evening, or if a blade cracked without cause, he was expected to understand the metal, the weather, the weight of things, and even the signs of coming storms or curses. It wasn't unusual for someone to ask him for advice, not related to smithing at all. Is this a good day to plant wheat, or do you think my brother's fever is a sign of bad luck? These questions were met, not with irritation, but with the weary patience of someone who knew his value extended beyond the physical. Indeed, the blacksmith's work was so embedded into the spiritual life of the village that he was sometimes asked to make iron charms, horseshoe talismans, or iron keys, to be buried at crossroads to ward off the devil. And yet, for all this, his own life remained grounded, ritualistic, and profoundly physical. There was the wake-up ritual, checking the tools, blowing life into the embers, squinting into the coals like a priest reading sacred scripture. There was the breakfast, usually simple, coarse bread dipped in ale or water, maybe an onion or bit of cheese, if fortune allowed, and then the day began in earnest. The forge grew louder, hotter, more alive with each passing hour. The heat did not relent in summer, and only grew sharper in winter, when it cut through the cracks in the wall like a thief. There were few breaks, and the idea of rest was foreign. Lunch might be taken standing, one hand still black with soot and oil, the other holding a crust of bread or cold meat. His back ached constantly, but no one asked about that. The pain was as much a part of the uniform as the leather apron or the heavy boots. Apprentices sometimes shared the load, but they were often more trouble than help burning things, bending things, breaking things, though they also reminded the master of his younger days, when he too had first learned the strange language of the anvil. The blacksmith's daily soundtrack was relentless and rhythmic. The sharp ping of metal, the roar of bellows, the hiss of steam, and the occasional string of creative curses when something went awry. There was also the constant presence of animals' horses being shod, dogs lingering for scraps, crows watching from the rooftops, and the inevitable swarm of flies in the summer heat. And then came the unexpected visitors, pilgrims with broken staffs, wandering monks in need of cooking hooks, peddlers with carts whose wheels threatened collapse. The smith never turned them away, even if their payment came in riddles or prayers or a few silver coins stained green with age. And yet, beneath all this visible labor, there was another kind of work happening, one that no one saw. The blacksmith was a custodian of memory. Each tool he made held the shape of his hand. Each repair was a silent testimony to his care. Each blade bore the echo of his discipline. His was not a craft that courted fame, and few would remember his name a generation later. But every hinge on a church door, every axe in a farmer's shed, every iron gate creaking in the wind, was a ghost of his labor. In that way, the blacksmith achieved a kind of immortality not through song or sculpture, but through the persistence of usefulness. And perhaps, at the end of it all, that was enough. Enough to justify the cracked skin, the sleepless nights, the solitude. Enough to stand before the forge, once more, and light the fire again, of your script, written exactly as required in one continuous paragraph. Despite the blacksmith's life being consumed by constant toil, flame, and the rattling groan of iron, there were still moments that demanded something more than just labor, moments of ceremony, of communal participation, and of strange old customs that refused to die even as the medieval world changed slowly around them. One such example was the curious practice of blessing the anvil on holy days, especially around the feast of Saint Eligius, the patron saint of metal. In some regions, a village priest would walk into the blackened forge with incense and a procession of locals behind him, waving sprigs of herbs to cleanse the air of demons or bad spirits. The blacksmith, dressed only slightly cleaner than usual, might stand beside his anvil with a bowl of water and a scrap of blessed cloth. They would chant prayers while the bellows were pumped once, ceremonially. Then all would clap when the hammer was struck, in symbolic rhythm, 3 times for the Trinity, 7 times for luck, once to banish evil from the metal. It wasn't always solemn. Some villagers treated it like a local holiday, especially if cakes or ale were served afterward. But to the blacksmith, it was often a reminder that his trade was not entirely his own. It belonged to something larger than himself, latticework, of belief, obligation, and superstition that tethered his every motion to a world of invisible forces. And there were other ceremonies too, some whispered, some shouted, like the forging of swords for knights or noblemen. A sword was never just a tool of violence. It was a sacred object, a vessel of honor, bound by oaths, and occasionally washed in wine or blessed with Latin words, scrawled into its fuller. The blacksmith had to treat such commissions with a strange blend of reverence and pragmatism, for he knew that poor iron or a flawed quench could doom a man in battle. There was pressure in that knowledge, and not only from the steel itself. Nobles might offer generous coin, but also severe expectations. One minor lord, for instance, might want the sword to carry his family crest etched near the guard, while another might request a blade that made a distinct sound when drawn, a hiss, or a ring that would announce death like a herald's trumpet. The smith could not always deliver such fanciful requests, but he learned to nod, to suggest alternatives, to navigate between myth and metallurgy without offending egos too grand to temper. On the other end of the social spectrum were the more desperate commissions: shackles for prisoners, iron collars for criminals, even locks for village stocks. These were not proud projects, but they paid. And they too required a steady hand, a heart capable of compartmentalizing. For the blacksmith might see the same man he'd made shackles for come begging for work days later. Or worse, hear the rattle of those same cuffs at dawn when the sheriff passed through with a trembling thief in tow. It was a grim dance, and the forge gave no opinion, only heat and hammer and the slow surrender of iron. Still, the blacksmith's world was not all shadow. There were marriages he had helped enable by crafting the ornate hinges for a couple's first home, or by shaping the ceremonial iron ring that hung over the hearth. There were births announced with gifts of iron charms, shaped crudely but lovingly into stars, birds, or horseshoes. And there were funerals, where sometimes a blacksmith's nail sealed a casket, or an iron cross he had hammered stood above, a humble grave. These were the quiet threads of his legacy, woven through the lives of people who barely noticed him unless their gate squeaked or their axe snapped. It was, in that way, a life defined by moments that were both invisible and indispensable. But this duality took its toll. The blacksmith aged faster than most, his body worn by years of standing on uneven floors, leaning into roaring fires, and absorbing the relentless shock of metal on metal. His hearing was often dulled by middle age, his shoulders uneven from the constant swinging, and his hands, his most valuable tools, became scarred landscapes of burn marks, calluses, and barely healed splits. He would often sleep poorly, not just from the pain in his joints, but from the residual ringing of the forge in his ears, a phantom hammer echoing long after the real one had gone silent. And yet, he rose each day before the sun, as if guided by an instinct deeper than habit, as if the forge itself called him like a child calls a parent in the night. There were few luxuries in his world. Meals were simple, clothes were thick and coarse, and leisure was rare. When he did rest, it was often in silence, sitting outside the forge with a cup of something warm, watching the village pass him by as if he were part of the architecture. Children would wave, old men might nod, and he would nod back, never needing to say much. His language was iron, his emotions were folded into steel. Even love, when it appeared, had to fit within the bounds of his world. A blacksmith's courtship was slow, measured, and often tangled with obligations. He might fall for a baker's daughter, gifting her an iron trivet or a pothook shaped like a rose. She might smile, but know full well that marrying a blacksmith meant a life of soot, sweat, and solitude. There was no glamour in the forge-only reliability, and for some, that was enough. When marriage came, it did not change much. The forge remained the heart of his world, and the family, if he was lucky to have one, learned to orbit around it. Children might play near the doorway, but never cross the danger line. A wife might bring food, but learn not to interrupt when the iron was hot. Life in such a household revolved around timing and temperature. The blacksmith, though present, often lived in a different rhythm than the rest of his home, one governed by fire, not by bells. And so, the years passed like iron filings swept into a corner, barely noticed, yet accumulating all the same. Apprentices came and went. Some stayed, learning the trade until they were good enough to leave. Others gave up, scorched or humbled, or called elsewhere. The master would shake his head, offer a grunt of advice, and continue alone. And then, when age truly settled in, when the fire grew harder to start, when the hammer felt heavier, when the nights grew longer than the days, blacksmith might begin to contemplate the one thing he had spent his life ignoring, the end. Not the end of life, necessarily, but the end of relevance. For what is a smith who cannot swing? What is a forge without a fire? And yet, even in that twilight, there was dignity. Some older blacksmiths turned to teaching. Others became known for delicate work, filigree, hinges, fine chains, tasks that didn't demand brute strength but still required a steady eye and a lifetime's understanding of iron's moods. And a few simply kept going, stubborn as the anvils they stood beside, refusing to dim before the coals did. If they were fortunate, they died with a hammer in hand, or at least within sight of the forge. Their funerals were small, but poignant. Sometimes, the village bell would be rung with a hammer rather than a rope. Once for every decade the smith had served the village. The anvil might be draped in cloth, the forge allowed to go cold for a day, and then, slowly, life resumed. The fire was relit. The apprentices returned. The forge, like time, did not stop. And so the legacy continued. Not through name, but through noise. Through usefulness. Through the eternal ring of the hammer calling out into history, one echo at a time.